5:30 p.m. city bus. Crowded, tired people just wanting to get home. Nobody making eye contact. Everyone lost in their own world. A normal evening, a normal commute, till three young men started bothering a 19-year-old girl traveling alone. At first, it was just words. Then they started moving closer. The girl was uncomfortable, but nobody was helping. 30 people on that bus, just watching silently, staring at their phones, acting like nothing was happening. Nobody wanted to face those three guys. But the old man standing at the very back of the bus, by the window, was different. 67 years old, pale skin, old jacket. Just an ordinary grandfather. But his eyes were watching the situation differently. His hands were slowly forming fists. Because 45 years ago, those hands had been trained for very different things. And some reflexes never fade away. ... Welcome to Human Stories. Before we continue with this powerful tale of courage and hidden strength, tell me in the comments what city are you watching from today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter. The 47 bus route cut through downtown Seattle every weekday at exactly the same times. Morrison had been riding it for 3 years. Now, ever since his wife passed and he sold the house in the suburbs. Same seat when available, same quiet ride to his small apartment near Pike Place Market. Most days, nobody noticed him. That's exactly how he preferred it. Frank wasn't much to look at average height. Gray hair thinning on top, deep lines around his eyes that came from squinting into too many harsh suns in too many foreign countries, wore the same faded brown jacket every day, carried a small canvas bag, and never bothered anyone. To the regular commuters, he was just another old man marking time until his final stop. But there were things about Frank Morrison that didn't quite fit the image of a harmless retiree. The way he instinctively positioned himself near the back door, always keeping sight lines clear. How his eyes constantly swept the bus, cataloging faces, exits, potential threats. The way he stood with perfect balance, despite the bus lurching. Through traffic, feet slightly apart, weight centered. These weren't the habits of a man who'd spent his life behind a desk. That Tuesday evening started like any other. Frank climbed aboard at 5:27 p.m., nodded to the driver, a Jamaican man named Winston who'd been working the route for 15 years, and made his way to his usual spot. The bus was fuller than normal. Rain had driven more people to public transit. Instead of walking near the middle of the bus, sat a young woman, maybe 19, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She wore scrubs, probably getting off a shift at one of the downtown medical clinics. She had that tired look that comes from working on your feet all day, earbuds in. Staring out the window as the city rolled by, 3 seats behind her, 3. Young men in their early 20s had been getting progressively louder since boarding at Pioneer Square. They wore expensive sneakers, designer hoodies, the kind of kids who'd never known real consequences for their actions. The kind Frank had seen 1,000 times in a dozen different countries, pack hunters, who only showed courage when they outnumbered. Their prey, at first they were just talking among themselves, voices carrying over the low rumble of the diesel engine. Jokes about girls they knew, plans for the weekend. The usual posturing that young men do when they're trying to impress each other. Frank barely registered them until their attention shifted to the girl in scrubs. Yo, Miss Nurse, the tallest. One called out, loud enough for half the bus to hear. You got any medicine for a broken heart? The girl didn't respond, didn't even turn around. She pulled her earbuds out for a second, then put them back in, clearly hoping they'd lose interest. They didn't. Come on, beautiful, don't be like that, the second one chimed in. This one with bleach blonde hair and neck tattoos that looked like they'd been done in someone's basement, were just being friendly. Frank's jaw tightened slightly. His hands, which had been resting casually on the metal pole beside him, shifted position. Anyone with military training would have recognized the adjustment, moving to a ready position without appearing to do so. The third kid, shorter but built like he, spent serious time in the gym, stood up and moved 1 seat closer to the girl. Seriously, what's your name? We're not going to hurt you. Just want to talk. Now other passengers were starting to notice. A businessman in a suit glanced up from his tablet, frowned, then looked away. An elderly woman in the seat across the aisle pursed her lips in disapproval, but said nothing. A teenage boy with a backpack full of textbooks watched nervously but didn't move. This was the moment. Frank had seen play out 100 times before. The moment when decent people chose to look the other way because getting involved was too risky, too complicated, too potentially dangerous. The moment when predators learned they could operate with impunity because nobody would stand up to them. The girl finally turned around, her face showing the first signs of real fear. "Please, I just want to get home." "I'm not interested in talking," the tall one laughed, a sound without warmth. "Oh, she talks. See, we knew you were friendly. Come on, what's the harm in a conversation?" "Yeah," the blonde one added, moving to block the aisle on the other side of her seat. "We're nice guys, give us a chance." They weren't touching her yet, but they'd positioned themselves so she couldn't easily move. Classic intimidation tactics. Create the threat without crossing the line that would definitely bring consequences. Frank had seen insurgents use the same playbook in Iraq, testing boundaries. Probing for weakness, the driver Winston caught sight of what was happening in his rearview mirror. Frank could see him hesitating, probably trying to decide whether to pull over and call for help or try to handle it himself. The bus was still 10 minutes from the next major stop. Moving through a stretch of industrial area with nowhere safe to pull over, that's when the muscular kid made his mistake. He reached out and touched the girl's shoulder, ostensibly to get her attention, but really to establish physical dominance. "Don't be scared," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "We just want to get to know you." The girl jerked away. From his touch, genuine panic now visible in her eyes. She looked around desperately, silently pleading for someone, anyone, to help her. Frank Morrison had been trained to make split-second decisions in situations where hesitation meant death. He'd learned to read body language, to assess threat levels, to determine the exact moment when words gave way to violence. And he could see that moment approaching fast, 40-5 years ago. Gunnery Sergeant Frank Morrison had been one of the Marine Corps' top hand-to-hand combat instructors at Camp Pendleton. He'd trained thousands of Marines heading to Vietnam, teaching them not just how to fight, but how to survive. After the war, he'd worked for 20 years as a civilian instructor for various federal agencies, teaching agents how to neutralize threats quickly and quietly. He'd hoped those skills would never be needed again. The tall kid was leaning over the girl now, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a seductive whisper, but came across as pure menace. "Come on, baby, don't make this harder than it needs to be. We can do this the easy way or the hard way." That was enough. Frank Morrison took 3 steps forward, moving with a fluid grace that seemed to cut through the bus's chaos like a knife. Through water, didn't hurry, didn't shout, didn't announce himself. He simply appeared beside the 3 young men, like a ghost materializing from shadow. "Excuse me," he said quietly, his voice carrying despite its low volume. "I think the lady asked you to leave her alone." The 3 turned to look at him, and Frank could see the exact moment they sized him up and dismissed him as a threat. Old man, gray hair, probably some do-gooder who watched too many movies and thought he could play hero. The tall one laughed outright. "Mind your own business, Grandpa. This doesn't concern you." "Actually," Frank replied, his voice still conversational, "it does." The muscular kid stepped toward Frank, puffing up his chest in the universal young male display of aggression. "You need to back off, old man, before you get hurt." Frank didn't back off. He didn't move at all, just stood there, hands at his sides, completely relaxed. But something in his stance, something in the way he held himself, made the kid pause. "Here's what's going to happen," Frank said, his voice never rising above normal conversation level. "You 3 are going to return to your seats, ride quietly to your stop, and get off this bus without saying another word to that young lady. Or we're going to have a problem." The blonde one snorted. "Yeah, kind of problem, Pops?" Frank tilted his head slightly, and for just a moment, his eyes went completely cold. Not angry, not emotional, just empty in a way that suggested he'd seen things that would break most people's minds. It's the kind where you wake up in a hospital trying to remember your own names. There was something in his tone. Something that reached past bravado and spoke directly to the primitive part of the brain that recognizes genuine danger. The three young men suddenly weren't sure if they were dealing with a harmless old man or something else entirely. The muscular kid made the decision for them. He shoved Frank's shoulder. Not hard enough to knock him down, but forcefully enough to send a clear message about who was in charge. What happened next took less than 3 seconds. Frank's right hand moved in a blur, catching the kid's wrist and twisting it in a way that sent him immediately to his knees, a strangled cry escaping his lips. At the same time, Frank's left elbow snapped back, catching the tall one in the solar plexus and dropping him gasping to the floor. The blond one took a swing at Frank's head, but the old man ducked under it effortlessly and delivered a short, sharp punch to a pressure point just below the kid's ear. All three were on the ground, groaning and trying to figure out what had just happened to them. Frank straightened his jacket and looked down at them calmly. "Gentlemen," he said, "I suggest you stay down there until your stop comes up. And I suggest you remember that young lady isn't interested in conversation." The entire bus was dead silent. 30 passengers stared at the scene, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. 67-year-old man in a faded jacket had just dismantled 3 young, strong attackers like they were children. The girl in scrubs was staring at Frank with a mixture of gratitude and awe. Winston, the driver, had pulled over and was reaching for his radio. But Frank caught his eye in the mirror and gave a slight shake of his head. No need to involve the authorities unless the situation escalated further. Frank returned to his position. At the back of the bus, hands resting casually on the pole as if nothing had happened, the 3 young men slowly picked themselves up, pride bruised worse than their bodies, slumped into their seats without another word. But Frank could feel the weight of 30 pairs of eyes on him now. The businessman who'd looked away earlier was staring openly. The elderly woman was whispering to her companion. The teenage boy with the textbook bag had his phone out. He's probably trying to figure out if he should record what had just happened. The next major stop, the 3 troublemakers got off quickly, shooting venomous looks back at Frank, but making no move to continue the confrontation. The atmosphere on the bus relaxed immediately. The girl in scrubs turned around and looked at Frank for a long moment. "Thank you," she said simply. Frank nodded once.
"Oh, no."
"Thanks necessary, miss. But she wasn't done. What you did. That wasn't luck. You knew exactly what you were doing." Frank met her gaze steadily. "Sometimes old dogs remember a few tricks." "No," she said, studying his face more carefully. "That was training. Professional training." She paused, then asked quietly, "Military?" Frank was quiet for a moment, then gave the slightest nod. "A long time ago." The businessman had been listening to the exchange. Now he spoke up, his voice carrying across the silent bus. "What branch?" Frank looked at him, clearly reluctant to discuss it. "Marines? Vietnam?" The elderly woman asked, her earlier disapproval replaced by curiosity. Another nod. "What did you do in the Marines?" The teenage boy asked, his voice full of the awe that young people feel when they encounter real-world heroism. Frank was quiet for so long that it seemed like he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, "I taught other Marines how to stay alive." The bus pulled up to Frank's stop and he moved toward the door. But before he could step off, the girl in scrubs called out to him, "Sir, what's your name?" Frank paused at the door, looking back at her. After a moment, he said, "Frank Morrison." "You, Mr. Morrison? Really?" Frank nodded once more and stepped off the bus into the Seattle drizzle. Through the window, he could see the passengers still talking among themselves, probably trying to make sense of what they'd witnessed, what they didn't know. What Frank had never told anyone since he'd moved to Seattle was that Gunnery Sergeant Frank Morrison had been more than just a hand-to-hand combat instructor. He'd been one of the Marine Corps' most decorated close-quarters combat specialists. With 3 tours in Vietnam and a service record that was still classified 45 years later, he'd trained not just Marines, but Special Forces operators, CIA operatives, and federal agents. He'd written the manual on non-lethal neutralization techniques that was still used by law enforcement.
Agencies across the country.
He'd been personally responsible for developing training programs that had saved thousands of American lives in combat zones around the world. But to the people on bus 47, he was just Frank Morrison. A quiet old man who'd done the right thing when nobody else would. The next morning, Frank was waiting at his usual stop when Winston's bus pulled up. As he climbed aboard, Winston gave him a long look. "Everything all right, Frank?" "Everything's fine, Winston." "Good to know," Winston said, with a slight smile. "Good to know we got people like you riding my bus." Frank took his usual position at the back, and the ride proceeded normally. Noticed that several passengers from the previous evening were on board again, including the girl in scrubs. When she got off at her stop, she turned and gave him a small wave. At his stop, as Frank was leaving, Winston called out to him, "Frank, thanks for keeping things peaceful yesterday." Frank paused. "Just doing what anyone should do, Winston." "No," Winston said, meeting his eyes in the mirror. "That wasn't what anyone would do. That was something special." Frank walked away into another Seattle morning, just another face in the crowd. But 28 people on that bus now knew that sometimes the most ordinary-looking person can be the most extraordinary. Sometimes the quiet old man in the back has seen things and done things that most people can't imagine. Sometimes the hero doesn't wear a uniform or carry a badge. He just carries the knowledge that when good people do nothing, evil wins. And sometimes, just sometimes, evil picks the wrong old man to test. Frank Morrison had spent 45 years, hoping he'd never need to use those skills again. But when the moment came when a young woman needed help and nobody else was willing to provide it, those skills were still there. Sharp, precise, and ready to remind 3 punk kids that respect isn't negotiable, it's earned. And it's enforced by people who understand the difference between right and wrong. The story of Bus 47 spread quietly through the transit community, the way these stories do. Not on social media, not in the news, but through whispered conversations between drivers, shared glances between regular commuters, and the kind of urban legend that grows around real events when regular people witness something extraordinary. But Frank Morrison continued riding the 5:30 bus, standing quietly in the back, watching over his fellow passengers with the same vigilant eyes that had once watched over young Marines heading into combat, because some men never really retire from protecting others. They just change uniforms.